130 million records sold. Arenas packed on every continent. Songs so embedded in American culture that entire generations know every word without ever buying a single album. And yet, for decades, the critics refused to call him great. There is a man who wrote some of the most intimate songs in American music while remaining, for much of his life, a stranger to himself. 3 Broken Marriages, a film that publicly tore him apart. A diagnosis that stripped away the one thing that ever made him feel safe. How did a painfully shy kid from Brooklyn build one of the greatest live music empires the world had ever seen? What was it that the applause of 60,000 people could never heal inside him? And what happens when the stage, the only home he ever truly knew, is taken away for good? Before we answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. He was born on January 24, 1941, in the Coney Island neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, a borough that smelled of salt water and ambition, where immigrant families pressed their hopes into every brick, and every child carried the unspoken weight of becoming something greater than where they came from. His parents, Rose and Akiba Diamond, were Jewish immigrants navigating the particular loneliness of a country that offered opportunity with one hand and indifference with the other. The household was not cruel, but it was not warm either. It was functional, measured, built around survival rather than tenderness. In that apartment, love was understood, but rarely spoken. Affection was assumed, but seldom shown. For a boy wired for feeling, and Neil Diamond was always wired for feeling, that silence was its own kind of hunger. He was a quiet child, watchful, the kind of boy who absorbed everything around him and processed none of it aloud. His family moved frequently during his childhood, chasing better neighborhoods, better opportunities, the persistent American dream of the next place being the right place. Queens, the Bronx, back to Brooklyn. Each move meant new schools, new faces, new reasons to feel like the boy who had just arrived and hadn't yet figured out the rules. He never quite settled. Socially, he remained on the margins, present but not quite belonging, friendly but not fully known. What saved him, or at least gave him somewhere to put everything he couldn't say, was music. At 14, he received a gift that would quietly reorder his entire life: a guitar. And he did not attack it with the confidence of a born performer. He approached it the way he approached most things: slowly, privately, with a kind of reverence that suggested he already understood this was something serious. He taught himself chords. He wrote fragments of lyrics. He began to discover that the feelings he couldn't organize into speech could arrange themselves naturally into melody. Music was not a hobby. It was a translation. Summer camp at 16 gave him his first real glimpse of performance. There, a young Neil Diamond stepped onto a stage for the first time and sang in front of other people. The reaction was small by any future standard. A camp audience, summer heat, amateur acoustics. But the feeling it produced in him was enormous. For a few minutes, the invisible boy was seen. For a few minutes, the quiet one was heard. He later described that moment as the first time in his life he understood what it felt like to belong somewhere. He carried that feeling back to Brooklyn and never put it down. His academic life was unremarkable by conventional measure. He attended Erasmus Hall High School in Brooklyn, where, by a twist of fate that seems too perfectly scripted to be accidental, he shared a brief moment in the same school choir as a young Barbra Streisand. 2 future giants of American music, standing in the same room, neither yet knowing what they were becoming. He studied fencing, of all things, well enough to earn an athletic scholarship to New York University, a fact that amuses in retrospect. The image of the future king of arena rock, lunging with a foil in a gymnasium. But New York University was never really about the degree. It was about proximity to New York City's music world. It was about being close enough to smell the industry, to feel the pulse of what was possible. He enrolled as a pre-med student, perhaps because medicine felt like a responsible answer to the question of what he would do with his life. But music kept pulling. Songs kept arriving. The melodies wouldn't wait for graduation. He left New York University before finishing his degree, a decision that felt reckless to everyone around him and inevitable to him. He had $16 in his pocket, he had a guitar, and he had the absolute irrational certainty of a young man who has found the one thing that makes him feel real. What he didn't have was a plan, or connections, or any clear path forward. What followed were years that are easy to romanticize in retrospect, but were, in lived experience, grinding and often humiliating. He wrote songs in cheap offices, pitched them to producers who forgot his name before he reached the elevator, and collected rejection with the quiet persistence of someone who has no backup option. He worked for small publishing houses, earning $50 a week, when the checks came at all. He wrote songs that went nowhere. He wrote songs that went to other artists and became hits, while he remained unknown. He watched from the outside as his words gave other people their moments of recognition. The boy from Brooklyn, who had once stood in a camp spotlight and felt, for the first time, that he existed, was invisible again. But invisibility, for Neil Diamond, had never been a permanent condition. It had always been a waiting room, and he was done waiting. In the early 1960s, there was a building on Broadway that functioned less like an office block and more like a factory of dreams. The Brill Building, at 1619 Broadway in Midtown Manhattan, was where American popular music was being assembled, song by song, in tiny cubicles barely large enough for a piano and two people. Carole King was there, Neil Sedaka, Burt Bacharach, Lieber and Stoller, the greatest songwriting minds of a generation, packed into floors of fluorescent light and cigarette smoke, competing to write the next sound that would stop a nation in its tracks. Neil Diamond arrived there in the early 60s with the particular hunger of someone who has already waited too long. He signed a contract with Sunbeam Music for $50 a week. A figure that sounds almost comically small against the backdrop of what he would eventually earn, but which represented, in that moment, the first time anyone had officially decided his talent was worth paying for. It was validation measured in survival wages. He took it without hesitation. The work was relentless and impersonal. Each morning he arrived and was expected to produce, not to reflect, not to wait for inspiration, to produce. Songs were currency. Ideas were inventory. The Brill Building operated on the logic of a newsroom. Deadlines existed, output was everything, and the luxury of artistic paralysis was something nobody could afford. For a young writer still finding his voice, it was simultaneously the best education available, and an environment that could crush sensitivity if you weren't careful. Neil learned to be careful. He developed a discipline during those years that would define the rest of his career. He learned to write quickly, but not carelessly, to chase feeling within structure, to find the emotional core of a song and protect it, even when everything around the production was purely commercial. These were skills that most songwriters either had instinctively or never developed. Neil built them deliberately, in rooms where nobody was watching and nobody particularly cared. His first significant breakthrough arrived not under his own name, but through his pen. In 1966, he wrote Sunday and Me for Jay and the Americans, a song that climbed the charts and demonstrated to anyone paying attention that this quiet kid from Brooklyn could construct a melody that lodged itself inside people and refused to leave. It was the kind of hit that made industry insiders take a second look at a name they had been overlooking. But it was the Monkees who changed everything. In 1966, Neil Diamond wrote I'm a Believer, a song he sold to the newly formed television pop group for a fee that, by any subsequent measure, was absurdly low. The Monkees recorded it. It was released in November of that year and promptly obliterated every chart it touched. 7 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. More than 10 million copies sold worldwide, making it one of the best-selling singles of the entire decade. It was inescapable. It was everywhere. And it was one of those songs that seemed to have always existed and had simply been waiting to be discovered. And almost nobody knew Neil Diamond had written it. That anonymity contained a specific kind of pain that is difficult to fully articulate to anyone who hasn't experienced it. He had written one of the defining songs of 1966. He had created something that tens of millions of people loved and sang and carried with them. And he walked down the street without a single person recognizing his face. The boy who had first felt real standing in a camp spotlight, the young man who had spent years watching his words give other people their moments, was still watching from the outside. He was not bitter exactly, but he was clear-eyed about what it meant. Writing songs for other people to perform was a living. It was even, on its best days, a privilege. But it was not what he was built for. The Brill Building had taught him craft. The Monkees had proven his instincts were commercially undeniable. What neither had given him was the thing he had been chasing since that summer camp stage. He wanted to be the one standing in the light. He wanted to be the one the crowd was looking at. He began performing his own material with a new urgency. He signed with Bang Records and released Cherry Cherry in 1966, a raw, driving, guitar-forward track that sounded like nothing else in his catalog to that point. It reached #6 on the Billboard Hot 100 and introduced a different Neil Diamond to the world. Not the quiet architect behind other people's hits, not the Brill Building craftsman, but a performer, a presence, a voice. And the response confirmed what he had suspected. People didn't just like his songs, they liked him singing them. There was something in the grain of his voice, rough at the edges, unguarded at the center. It communicated authenticity in a way that polished production alone could never manufacture. The invisible boy was becoming visible. But visibility, as Neil Diamond would spend the next several decades learning, came with costs that nobody warned you about in advance. And the first of those costs was already beginning to take shape in the corners of a life that fame was just beginning to consume. There is a particular kind of performer who does not simply enjoy the stage. They need it. Not in the way a professional needs a workplace, but in the way a person gasping for air needs oxygen. The stage, for them, is not where they go to work. It is where they go to exist. Where the noise inside finally has somewhere to go. Where the silence of everything that came before is answered, at last, by the roar of something real. Neil Diamond was that kind of performer. From the moment he stepped out from behind the curtain of songwriting and began performing his own material, something became clear to anyone watching. This was not a man who had learned to perform. This was a man who had been performing his entire life. In his head, in his bedroom, in the imaginary arenas of a Brooklyn childhood where nobody came to watch. And the stage simply made it official. By the late 1960s, his live shows were becoming events. Not polished, choreographed spectacles, but raw, physical, emotionally overwhelming experiences driven almost entirely by the force of one man and his voice. He worked without the safety net of elaborate production. No backup dancers, no pyrotechnics, no theatrical concept to hide behind, just Neil Diamond, a microphone, a band, and a voice that somehow filled every corner of every room he ever walked into. His residency at the Troubadour in Los Angeles in 1967 became the kind of performance that people talked about for years afterward. Industry figures who attended left shaken. Critics who had been dismissive grew quiet. The consensus that emerged from those nights was reluctant but undeniable. Whatever Neil Diamond was doing up there, it worked in a way that defied easy explanation. He was not technically flawless. He was not conventionally cool. He was something more uncomfortable and more powerful than either of those things. He was honest. In an era when performance was increasingly becoming theater, when artifice and irony were fashionable currencies, Neil Diamond stood in front of crowds and simply meant every word he sang. There was no distance between the performer and the material. No protective layer of detachment. When he sang about longing, he was longing. When he sang about loss, the loss was visible in the set of his jaw and the way he gripped the microphone as though it were the only solid thing in the room. Audiences felt it not as entertainment, but as confession. That directness was magnetic. It was also, in the cultural climate of the late 1960s, deeply unfashionable. Rock critics, who had adopted irony and rebellion as their primary aesthetic values, looked at Neil Diamond and found nothing to celebrate. He was too earnest, too melodic, too openly emotional in a landscape that prized cool detachment. Rolling Stone and its contemporaries treated him with a particular brand of condescension, acknowledging his commercial success in the same breath as dismissing his artistic legitimacy. He sold millions of records, which in those circles was held against him rather than for him. He was aware of it. He could not have been otherwise, and it lodged in him like a splinter, not deep enough to disable him, but persistent enough to never fully disappear. Decades later, he would admit that the critical dismissal of those years left a wound that the applause of 100 sold-out arenas never entirely healed. That no matter how many people stood in the dark and sang his songs back to him, some part of him always heard the silence of the critics louder. It is a particular cruelty that follows certain artists through their entire careers. The inability to fully receive the love that is freely given, because the love that was withheld by parents, by peers, by gatekeepers, left an absence too old and too deep to be filled by applause alone. His personal life during this period reflected the same fracture. In 1963, he had married Jay Posner, his high school sweetheart. A marriage built in the years before fame, when he was still the quiet boy from Brooklyn with a guitar and an irrational certainty. They had 2 daughters together, Marjorie and Elin, and for a time, the domestic architecture of a normal life held. But fame is a specific kind of solvent. It does not destroy lives violently or all at once. It dissolves the small things first, the evenings at home, the ordinary dinners, the unremarkable Tuesday nights that, in retrospect, turn out to have been the entire foundation. Touring took him away for months at a time. The momentum of a career accelerating faster than he had planned pulled him in directions that a marriage built on proximity and routine could not follow. By 1969, the marriage was over. He threw himself back into the work with the intensity of a man who has decided that the stage is safer than any room with 2 people in it. The 1970s arrived, and with them a new scale of success, that would have been unimaginable to the boy writing songs in Brill Building cubicles. The Hot August Night Live album, recorded at the Greek Theater in Los Angeles in 1972, became one of the best-selling live albums in recording history. It captured something that studio recordings could only approximate: the specific electricity of Neil Diamond in front of a crowd that had given itself over completely to the experience. He filled Madison Square Garden. He filled the Hollywood Bowl. He sold out venues across Europe, Australia, and South America. By the mid-70s, he was not simply a successful recording artist. He was a phenomenon. One of the highest-grossing live performers on the planet, in the company of a very small number of artists whose names alone could fill any arena in any city on any night. And yet, in the quiet after each show, when the lights went down and the crowd dispersed into the night, carrying their piece of the evening, Neil Diamond was left with the same silence that had always been there. The roar of 60,000 voices could not follow him into the dressing room. The standing ovation ended at the stage door. What waited beyond it was the familiar landscape of a man who had learned to belong everywhere in public and nowhere in private. He married again in 1969, the same year his first marriage ended. Marcia Murphy, a production assistant, became his second wife. She was steady where he was turbulent, grounded where he was restless. They would build a life together that lasted, against considerable odds, for 25 years. 2 sons, Jesse and Micah, arrived, and for stretches of time, the family life that fame had disrupted with Jay seemed within reach again. But the hunger of the stage never diminished. The touring never slowed. The work never paused long enough for ordinary life to take root in the way a family needs it to. Marcia held the architecture of their home together with a patience and dedication that Neil would later acknowledge with a guilt that time never fully dissolved. He was there, and then he was gone, and then he was there again. Present enough to love, absent enough to damage. The crowds kept coming. The records kept selling. And somewhere inside all of it, Neil Diamond kept searching for the thing that 50,000 people singing his name back to him had never quite managed to provide. The boy who had first felt real in a spotlight was still, in some essential way, looking for home. By the late 1970s, Neil Diamond had achieved a level of commercial dominance that most artists spend entire careers chasing and never reach. His records sold in numbers that defied categorization. His tours generated revenues that rivaled the biggest acts in the world. His name, once unknown outside the narrow corridors of the Brill Building, was now recognized on every continent. He had, by any external measure, arrived. And yet, for a man wired the way Neil Diamond was wired, arrival was never quite enough. There was always something further, something larger, something that would finally answer the question that fame and fortune, for all their considerable weight, had never managed to silence. He was not greedy in the conventional sense. He was not chasing money or power for their own sake. He was chasing legitimacy, or the kind that critics had withheld, the kind that required not just commercial success, but artistic validation. The acknowledgement from the industry's most respected voices that what he did mattered beyond the box office. And so, in 1980, Neil Diamond made a decision that he believed would change the conversation entirely. He agreed to star in a remake of The Jazz Singer, a film that carried enormous symbolic weight, being a reimagining of the very first sound film in Hollywood history. It was an audacious move, a statement of ambition so large it nearly obscured the considerable risks attached to it. He threw himself into the project with a total commitment that those around him described as consuming. He was not simply acting in a film. He was reinventing himself. He was reaching for the kind of legitimacy that a music career, however stratospheric, had never delivered. The jazz singer would prove that Neil Diamond was not merely a pop phenomenon, but a genuine artist, the kind who could command a screen as naturally as he commanded a stage. The film was released in November of 1980. The reviews were devastating. Critics did not simply dismiss it. They dismantled it with a thoroughness that felt, to those close to Neil, almost personal. His acting was called wooden. The script was called thin. The production was called dated. The project that was meant to reframe the conversation about Neil Diamond instead became the loudest possible confirmation of everything his detractors had always said. That his appeal was narrow, his range limited, and his ambitions larger than his abilities. And he read the reviews. He could not have avoided them. And the wound they opened was different from the wounds that had come before. The critical indifference of the late 60s had been dismissive. This was something sharper. This was public. This was specific. This was the industry looking at his most vulnerable, most exposed creative effort and finding it wanting. What made it genuinely cruel was the contradiction at its center. The soundtrack album was a massive commercial success. Love on the Rocks and Hello Again both became top 5 hits. Millions of people bought the record, watched the film, and found exactly what they had always found in Neil Diamond. An emotional directness that bypassed cynicism and landed somewhere real. The public, as they so often had, voted with their wallets and their hearts in his favor. But the public's verdict was not the one he needed. He had wanted the other verdict. The one from the rooms where critics sat. The one from the industry that had always held him at arm's length. And that verdict, delivered with unusual cruelty, was no. He retreated into the work the way he always had when life became difficult, with an intensity that served simultaneously as therapy and self-punishment. He recorded, he toured, he delivered. But those closest to him noticed a change after The Jazz Singer. A guardedness that had not been there before. A reluctance to expose himself in the same total way he once had. As if the film had taught him that full vulnerability, offered without protection, invited wounds that took years to close. His marriage to Marcia was absorbing the collateral damage of all of it. The relentless touring, or the emotional unavailability that followed the film's failure. The particular loneliness of a man surrounded by people who needed things from him but rarely asked how he was. Marcia had spent 25 years holding the household together, while Neil held the world's attention. She had raised their sons through absences that stretched from weeks into months. She had been patient in a way that went beyond what patience normally requires. By 1994, after 25 years of marriage, it was over. The end of a 25-year marriage is not a single event. It is the accumulated weight of 1,000 smaller moments. Each missed dinner, each canceled plan, each evening when the man who could bring 60,000 strangers to tears came home and had nothing left to give the people who needed him most. Yet Neil later spoke about the end of his marriage to Marcia with an honesty that was unsparing toward himself. He did not assign blame elsewhere. He understood what the work had cost. He understood what he had prioritized, and what that prioritizing had taken from the people who deserved better. The guilt of that understanding was not the kind that fades with time. It was the kind that settles into a person and becomes part of how they move through the world, visible in the pauses between sentences, in the way certain questions produce a silence before an answer. He was 53 years old, twice divorced. The sons from his second marriage were growing up in a home where their father was more often absent than present. For the daughters from his first marriage carried their own histories of a father who had been consumed by something larger than family. And yet the work continued. The tours continued. The records continued. Because for Neil Diamond, stopping was never really an option. Stopping meant silence. And silence, for a man who had spent a lifetime filling it with music, was the one thing he had never learned to survive. In 1996, at 55 years old, he married for a third time. Rachel Farley, a woman significantly younger than him, seemed to offer a different kind of beginning. A chance, perhaps, to build the domestic life that the previous decades had consistently dismantled. Those who knew him well watched with cautious hope. Neil Diamond, in love, was always a man capable of extraordinary tenderness, and the same emotional capacity that poured itself into his music could, in the right circumstances, pour itself into a person. But the patterns that had shaped two previous marriages had not been dismantled by reflection alone. They had been built over decades and reinforced by a career that left no room for the ordinary rhythms of shared life. The third marriage ended not long after it had begun. A brief chapter that closed almost before it had fully opened, leaving behind more questions than answers. And a man now entering his later years with 3 marriages behind him, and a loneliness that success had never managed to cure. What endured through all of it was the music. Not because the music was more important than the people he had loved and lost, but because the music, unlike everything else in his life, had never rejected him, had never grown tired of his absences, or his intensity, or his inability to fully arrive anywhere that wasn't a stage. The music received everything he gave and asked for nothing in return. And in that unconditional acceptance, Neil Diamond found the only relationship in his life that had never, not once, let him down. It was a beautiful thing, and it was, in its own quiet way, a tragedy. There is a particular kind of loss that arrives not as a single blow, but as a slow, quiet subtraction. Not the sudden violence of an accident or the sharp grief of a death, but something more insidious, the gradual erosion of the very thing that made you who you are. For Neil Diamond, that loss began in 2015, when he received a diagnosis that the public would not learn about for 3 more years: Parkinson's disease, a neurological condition that attacks the body's ability to control movement. A tremor in the hands, a stiffness in the limbs, a progressive, irreversible rewriting of the body's fundamental instructions. For most people, it is devastating enough. For a man whose entire identity had been built around physical performance, the movement across a stage, the grip of a microphone, the physical act of being present in front of a crowd, it was something beyond devastation. It was the one loss he had never been prepared for. He kept the diagnosis private for 3 years. Those close to him during that period describe a man processing something immense in the only way Neil Diamond knew how to process anything. Quietly, internally, alone with it in the spaces between performances. He continued to tour, he continued to record, he stood on stages in arenas around the world and gave everything he had to crowds who had no idea that every performance was now carrying the weight of a countdown. In January 2018, he was in the middle of his 50th anniversary world tour when the progression of the disease made it impossible to continue. He made the announcement publicly, with a directness and a dignity that surprised those who had expected a man of his generation to find a softer way to say it. He had Parkinson's. He was retiring from touring. The tour was over. The reaction from the public was immediate and overwhelming. Social media filled with tributes. Radio stations played his catalog in long, uninterrupted stretches. fans who had seen him perform 20, 30, 40 times wrote about what his music had meant to them with a specificity and an emotion that demonstrated, more clearly than any chart position ever had, the depth of the relationship between this man and the people who had spent their lives listening to him. What the tributes could not fully capture was what retirement meant for Neil Diamond personally. The stage had been his home for more than 50 years, and it had been the place where the invisible boy from Brooklyn became real, where the silence of a childhood starved of affection was answered by the noise of tens of thousands of people who had come specifically to hear him. To stand in that roar and feel in his bones that he existed and that his existence mattered. That was gone now, not because he had chosen to walk away, but because his own body had made the decision for him. And for a man who had spent his entire life fighting for control of his career, of his narrative, of the terms on which the world would see him, to have the most important chapter ended by something beyond his control was a reckoning of the deepest kind. He settled into a quieter life in Los Angeles. He continued to write music because the act of writing, unlike the act of performing, remained within reach. He stayed largely out of the public eye, emerging occasionally for an interview or a rare appearance, each time looking slightly smaller than the man who had once filled Madison Square Garden with nothing but his voice. Those who spent time with him during this period spoke of a man who had, in the enforced stillness of retirement, found a kind of peace that the relentless momentum of a 50-year career had never allowed. He read. He spent time with his children and grandchildren. He discovered that ordinary days, stripped of the extraordinary machinery of fame, had their own texture and their own value, but they also spoke of the grief. The particular grief of a performer, separated from the stage. The way his eyes changed when music came on in a room. A flicker of something that was not quite sadness, but was not entirely anything else either. The way he sometimes paused mid-conversation, as if listening for something that wasn't there anymore. The ghost of a roar that 60,000 people used to make, still echoing somewhere in a silence only he could hear. He had given the world Sweet Caroline and Cherry Cherry and America and Hello Again. He had written songs that would outlast him by generations. He had stood on stages on every continent and made strangers feel less alone. And now the stage was quiet. The boy from Brooklyn had finally stopped running. There is a moment at every Neil Diamond concert that people who were there never forget. The opening notes of Sweet Caroline rising through the dark. The crowd recognizing it before the first word is sung. 60,000 voices filling the arena with something that no longer belongs to the man on the stage. Something that has become communal, shared. A piece of the emotional furniture of millions of lives. That is legacy. Not the records sold. Not the arenas filled. Not the charts conquered, or the critics eventually, reluctantly, corrected. Legacy is a song that belongs to everyone now. Neil Diamond spent a lifetime searching for the thing that would finally make him feel real. He found it, as most people do, not in the extraordinary moments, but in the ordinary ones. A grandchild's laugh, a quiet morning, a song finished in an empty room with nobody listening. The invisible boy from Brooklyn was never invisible. He simply had to spend 50 years proving it to himself. He did. And the music he left behind will keep proving it long after the silence is complete.